Well, welcome back to No to NATO, No to War for tonight's special broadcast. If you're watching from London, it's 9 p.m. We are 4 p.m. in New York, and coming to you live from Sydney, Australia. It's 8 o'clock in the morning here, and I'm your host for tonight's show, Aussie Cossack. It's a pleasure to be here co-hosting a show that was founded by the great George Galloway, our esteemed colleague, broadcaster, political party leader of the Workers' Party in Great Britain, or formerly known as Great Britain. Maybe one day it'll become great again. Certainly there's a lot of greatness happening today around the world, and the world is teetering on the edge of a new era, a new time where world leaders such as Trump, such as Putin, such as Orban, and others will play a key role in forming the future of the map of Europe. Now, I've said this before, I'll say it again. We're on the cusp of perhaps a Potsdam-style or a Yalta-style conversation between major world leaders. And it looks like everybody will be invited to that conversation besides Zelensky. Now, NATO certainly has played a role in warmongering, the main role since the days of its founding, since after the Second World War. And in the last few years, President Trump, who has now been elected but hasn't formally assumed office, has been very critical of some of NATO's members, criticizing them that they're not pulling their weight, that America cannot continue sponsoring. Of course, we know that this is all just bravado and talk. It's in an effort to force NATO players, or NATO puppets, should we call them, to pay their way, to increase their spend. And of course, if you're a NATO member and you're spending money, that money is going directly into the coffers of the United States military-industrial complex. So first and foremost, let's not forget that President Trump, who has now been elected, and thank goodness it wasn't Kamala, President Trump is a businessman. He always was a businessman. His offsider, his key man who has helped him come to power and into power is, of course, Elon Musk, who is now heading the Department of Government Efficiency, another businessman. These men are here to make money, and these men are here to cut red tape. We'll see what that eventuates into. Well, Elon Musk, if you're watching tonight, many people, thousands of people are watching on your platform, X, formerly known as Twitter. So share this broadcast on YouTube, share this broadcast on Rumble. Unfortunately, Twitter has been a little bit cheeky lately. We're not sure if this is Elon himself or others, but there has been a bit of suspending and blocking and censoring of information. Well, look, what can I just say in regards to that? Those people that helped Kamala be defeated in the United States presidential election, it's not a bad thing to defeat Kamala. And I was one of them. I was accused by CNN, by the Western media, of being engaged in misinformation against Kamala Harris. Well, of course we all were. Who wants Kamala to win? I mean, one day I'm sure Elon will appreciate the fact that there are so many people on social media, on platforms such as X, which he owns, that helped Trump get elected. Now, why did we help Trump get elected? Many of us watching tonight maybe don't like Trump, or they don't like Kamala either, because both of them would have been bad for Palestine and good for the Israeli Defense Force. But at least on the continent of Europe, Trump has been very, very clear. Asked repeatedly during the lead up to the presidential elections, does he want Ukraine to win? Trump refused to answer that question, instead saying he wants to save the millions and millions of lives which are being lost, which is quite reasonable. But at the end of the day, NATO does not care about Ukrainian lives. NATO does not care how many Ukrainians will die. Zelensky does not care, because Zelensky himself is not a person who shares the Christian religion of 98% of Ukraine. In fact, Zelensky is persecuting Christianity, persecuting the Christian church, arresting and force mobilizing, sending people to their deaths, young men, old men, anybody. The country is being exploited. It's being drained for resources, for blood. And that's one of the reasons why perhaps Trump may make a deal, because there are resources available in Ukraine. So from a business perspective, there is a way to fix Ukraine's massive debt. And that, of course, leads down the dark road to BlackRock. Of course, BlackRock heavily involved. Anywhere there's a war, anywhere there's NATO, anywhere there's then rebuilding and reparations you'll see Blacklock's fingerprints. You'll feel their dirty, ghastly, evil fingerprints all over the place. And Ukraine is no exception. Ukraine is full of natural resources. It's full of beautiful, good people, women, particularly, unfortunately, under Zelensky, being exploited in the brothels of Europe. Let's just face it. The whole country, men, women and children are being exploited. The Ukrainian organ trade, illegal organ trade, booming. Child trafficking, booming. And this is what NATO has brought to Ukraine. And this is what Russia has sought to stop. Russia has sought to fix. Russia still, after all these years, still views Ukraine as a brotherly country, as a brotherly people, as a Christian Orthodox neighbor. In fact, more than a neighbor, Ukraine historically was always part of Russia. And those who deny that on the basis that they want Ukraine to drift towards Europe. They want Ukraine to join the EU, join NATO. Well, sure, Western Ukraine, Lvov, Galicia, those areas which were formerly part of Poland, which were formerly part of Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, sure, they can join Europe because those lands were never Ukrainian. They were joined by Joseph Stalin under the Soviet Union. But the majority of Ukraine, Eastern Ukraine, Southern Ukraine, Crimea, the Donbass, Kherson, Zaporozhye, region Donetsk, region Lugansk, People's Republics, these areas have always been speaking Russian, always been Russian. And this is where Russia has made a stance. And on tonight's show, of course, we're going to be exploring what hypotheticals and what potential scenarios would Trump bring to the table. And we can see already the signals that Trump is giving us of perhaps what he's going to do in his presidency. We'll be speaking shortly with esteemed commentator Rachel Blevins. Rachel from the United States. She's a fantastic journalist. She knows her stuff about geopolitics. We'll welcome her shortly. She's written extensively about the NATO proxy war in Ukraine against Russia. We're then joined by Peter Ford, a distinguished former ambassador to Syria and Bahrain. He's the deputy leader of the Workers' Party of Britain. We look forward to speaking with him. He's formerly been interviewed by Tucker Carlson, and he's coming up soon, so stay tuned. Piers Robinson will be joining us, a British academic researcher in the field of media studies, founder of the Working Group on Syria, Propaganda and Media, and he's authored a number of publications on the CNN effect. So stay tuned. Make sure you hit the share and like button on tonight's broadcast. Wherever you may be, tonight's show may be censored. So feel free to download this show, rebroadcast this show. It's an important show to put a line in the sand here only days after the President of the United States, Trump, has squarely and fairly defeated Kamala. But our work in terms of fighting against NATO and stopping NATO is only beginning. Some people would have thought that, well, now that Trump's in power, things are going to slow down. Ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you, if you're part of the free world, if you're watching this broadcast tonight, and if you want to say no to NATO and no to war, well, our work is only beginning. Things are going to get heated up. Things are going to heat up, and things are going to become very interesting over the next few months, days, and weeks as we approach into this new era. Some people call it a new world order. I'm opposed to a new world order, but I'm opposed to the old new world order. We want the world to go back to how it was, where it was a good place, where countries were great and people were great and religion was protected and people's rights were protected. And NATO was not the schoolyard bully on its own deciding where wars would start and when wars would finish. We need a multipolar world, and this is, in fact, what the world is now becoming, multipolar, and that's a great thing to celebrate. Because I do believe there could be peace very soon. The Zelensky scam is over. People have woken up to that. And that's very clear that all around the Western world, Ukrainian flags have disappeared from biographies, from Twitter accounts, from Facebook accounts, from Telegram accounts. There is not that same level of support that there was. Those people who support the current thing, they've realized that Zelensky is not the savior. Zelensky is, in fact, the person who eventually will be deposed by his own people and removed by his own people in Ukraine for what he has done to that country, where there could be plenty and plenty of potential for peace, for friendship, as long as NATO would not be in the picture. But without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I'd love to now welcome our first guest for tonight's special broadcast of NATO-NATO, and that is Rachel Blevins, joining us from the United States, where it is 4:12 p.m. Rachel, welcome to NATO-NATO.
Thank you so much for having me.
Rachel, it's a pleasure to speak with you tonight. Well, look, the election is done and dusted. I think you, as many Americans, are relieved that Kamala did not win the election, that it was not rigged again. Trump is in power. Let's start with that. What's the vibe over there? Do people have hope? Is there a new perspective on the horizon for the American people themselves?
It's been an interesting week here, right? We got the outcome of the election. I was happy to see that it was over. It was one of those where it felt like we were in campaign mode for much longer than we actually were leading up to it. As far as Trump winning, I will always be cautious when it comes to Donald Trump. And that does not mean that I wanted Kamala Harris to win, but that does mean that I know how Trump operates. And as we saw with his first term, he campaigned one way, and then he started announcing cabinet picks, and we were seeing him announce neocons galore. And we've seen a new version of that this time around. Now, it's not everybody, right? It doesn't apply to all of his cabinet picks. But he has gotten plenty in there that I'm looking at and going, for instance, Marco Rubio as Secretary of State. If you would have asked me even a couple of weeks ago, would Marco Rubio, the ultra hawk, right, the man who never met a war that he didn't like, that he would be our next Secretary of State, our diplomat to go around the world to hopefully meet with others like Sergei Lavrov of Russia and have sane talks with them, I would not say that Marco Rubio is the man for the job. So I have some very serious concerns about some of the cabinet picks, well, a good number of them that are on key foreign policy positions. And it's interesting because we had, election night, you had this excitement of, okay, Trump won, and then you start watching his cabinet take shape and you start looking at, his new Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, who I know a number of people are looking at this guy and going, it seems as though he came out of nowhere, but he has very hawkish views as well. And so the overwhelming feeling that we're getting from the people that he has chosen on key foreign policy positions is that they are extremely pro-Israel, which means that they are going to continue to be supportive of Israel's genocidal war against the Palestinians in Gaza. They're also extremely anti-Iran, which raises a lot of concerns about whether the U.S. could back an all-out war against Iran in the Middle East. And they're also very anti-China. So while you may get some that look at Russia and they say, we don't want to go to World War III against Russia, let's pull back from the proxy war in Ukraine. Well, at the same time, they're also looking over here with their eye on China. So I would say I'm very cautious moving forward, and a lot remains to be seen when it comes to what the Trump administration's foreign policy is going to look like in the second term.
Rachel, you make an excellent point, and the appointment of Senator Marco Rubio, he's a senior member of both the Foreign Relations and Intelligence Committees and a former political rival to Donald Trump, to the position of Secretary of State. Trump has, I quote, said that he will be a strong advocate for our nation, a true friend to our allies, and a fearless warrior who will never back down to our adversaries. In Australia, there's been also some outrage. Our colleague, Professor Augusta Zimmerman from Western Australia, has said that it's an absolute disgrace that Trump has appointed Marco Rubio. Marco Rubio is a warmonger, and his appointment is a huge slap in the face to the millions of Americans who voted for peace in Ukraine and the Middle East. Trump's emerging national security team is shaping up to be a kettle of hawkish neocons who crave war at the cost of more innocent lives. And that is the position of Australian commentators. And look, it is pretty clear that this is not good news for Palestine and for peace in the Middle East, the appointment of such characters. I want to ask you about the relationship between Palestine, Israel, Iran, Russia, Ukraine. I'm firmly of the belief that you can't solve one without the other, and any deal to solve one should not leave the other to decide. It should, for example, there should not be peace in one part of the world at the expense of an escalation in another. And we know that the only country in the world who has very strong influence over Iran, for example, and who is very friendly with Iran, and Iran considers Russia that country. That is the one country, the one leader, Vladimir Putin, who can speak to Iran. So do you think there is scope here, Rachel, for a meeting between Trump and Putin? As Trump has always promised, it'll take him 24 hours to solve these conflicts. Would they sit down, and who would be the winners and the losers of a deal which two gentlemen like Trump and Putin would sit down over a cup of tea in the Kremlin to solve? What is a potential scenario, firstly, for war, or secondly, hopefully, for peace?
Yeah, I mean, I am hopeful that at least under a Trump administration, there will be talks with Russia of some sort, right? Because that is one thing that the Biden administration has absolutely refused, is any kind of dialogue, any kind of peace talks that involve both Russia and Ukraine. Now, when it comes to the situation that Trump is walking into, we're nearly 3 years into this at this point, and Russia is not losing, right? Their forces are advancing in the Donbass. Their forces are also advancing in the Kursk region. They are weeding out the Ukrainian troops there that launched an incursion months ago. And so when you look at that situation, and then you look at the reported plans that have been brought up in the Western media of what Trump and his team could be proposing, it's hard to see a world in which, if they go with the plans that are being reported, and I know that they are being put out there by anonymous sources, but those plans are essentially saying that Trump and his team want to go to Russia and say, hey, well, let's freeze this war. We'll freeze it for 20 years. We'll promise that Ukraine is not going to become a member of NATO. And then at the same time, for those 20 years, it will allow NATO to then fill Ukraine with weapons and basically build back up their military. And the reason why they're saying 20 years is because their hope is that Putin is eventually going to pass away, and then they're going to deal with a new Russian leader and try to strong arm whoever that new person is into doing what they want. Now, from Russia's perspective, they've been through the Minsk agreements. They attempted the Istanbul talks of 2022. So if you've got Trump coming in and saying, hey, we've got this great agreement, right? Zelensky has agreed that he won't join NATO for 20 years. Don't pay attention to the part where NATO continues to build up Kiev's military and you have all of these Western weapons still right on your border. If that's the case, then I don't see Putin, acting kindly about that agreement, right? He's likely to say, no, we're not doing this. And also, here are our demands on our end. You're going to have to meet those demands. And given the fact that Trump has surrounded himself with so many neocons, I know that, people like Marco Rubio right now, they're a little bit more tame about their rhetoric when it comes to Russia, right? They will admit that there needs to be some sort of negotiated settlement on Ukraine. They will admit that there is not going to be a military victory for Kiev, but they're still neocons. And so I think my concern is, even if we have talks between Trump and Putin, they get together, Putin says, these are our demands, we're not accepting your agreement, and then Trump goes back to his neocon circle. What do they tell him next? Because I have a feeling they're not going to go out quietly, and we could see even more and more tensions involving the US versus Russia. And I think that's my major concern, is that even with Trump coming into this saying, I'm going to, end the war, I'm going to solve it in 24 hours, if he gets any kind of a no from Putin on a possible agreement, that he's going to then take that and say, well, I tried and Russia refused to work with me, not really acknowledging the fact that everything that we have seen from the US is acting as though Russia is currently losing this conflict. They are treating Moscow like it is on the losing side. And so I think it's going to be very important what the US actually decides to do and to present to Russia. And that could be the game changer in terms of how far we get towards a possible agreement.
Rachel, brilliantly said. And I think we can both agree that this is a case of will Trump be able to withstand the pressure of the deep state? And he's said many times that he will, and he's talked about the deep state openly, and so has Elon, and so has other members of Trump's team. But this is the question now. The Russian government, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, the Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov have indicated that they do not believe that a United States president can be independent, can make his own decisions, and that it's not a matter of who is in the Oval Office. It's a matter of who is in the office down the corridor next to the Oval Office, because those people never change, and those people will be there dictating the United States foreign policy, not from the perspective of a president, but from the perspective of big government, deep state government, military-industrial complex interests, and unfortunately, that's what Trump is up against, and that's who he needs to defeat first. Then he can go and try to fix the world. But the enemy for the United States people is at home in Washington. It's the lobbyists, it's the people with that inappropriate level of influence over the US government. Rachel, thank you very much for joining us with your insights tonight on No-to-NATO, and we look forward to speaking with you again shortly.
Thank you so much for having me.
Next guest, ladies and gentlemen, thank you, is Peter Ford. We're going to jump straight into there. We've got a limited time tonight all around the world, broadcasting in all time zones. But Peter Ford is a distinguished former ambassador to Syria and Bahrain. It's great to have his level of competency on the Middle East situation, because as we just mentioned with Rachel, the war which is being conducted by NATO in Ukraine cannot be solved or should not be solved without a broader strategy in the Middle East. Your Excellency, welcome to No-to-NATO. It's great to see you tonight.
Thank you very much. It's great to be back. This is my second appearance. George Galloway kindly had me on several months ago. I'm great to be back on now at this very important moment in world history.
Certainly, Peter, we are at a crossroads. We are a very important moment. I agree with you. The question is, which way is this going to head? I mean, in your opinion, as a former ambassador, as a person who's worked for the British Foreign Office in that capacity, how can you see this panning out? Trump's new election, his appointments that he's made, it's a bad sign, it's a bad start, but is there light at the end of the tunnel? Can we sit here and hope that there will be peace? Because those people ultimately, like myself, yourself, and millions of others around the world who have had enough of NATO's warmongering, we simply want peace. We want the killing to stop, the bloodshed to stop all around the world. In your opinion, what can we look forward to? What's your prediction over the next few weeks?
I think there's cause for cautious optimism. It would be easy to be skeptical about Trump, about his competence, about his choices with personnel, his poor track record last time. But hey, for once, let us enjoy the moment. I was so glad that he defeated the other lot, the Biden, Blinken crowd, the deep state behind them, the media. It's not very often that we're able to gloat a little bit. So let's enjoy the moment and give Trump a little bit the benefit of the doubt and accentuate the positive. And I see two positives. First, Trump has more or less painted himself into a corner on Ukraine by promising to solve Ukraine, end the war in quick time. He's put himself under immense pressure, and coming away with a failure is just not something that could be contemplated. How his promises are translated into a peace agreement or an armistice or some kind of resolution is another matter, and I suspect that Trump himself doesn't really have a roadmap for this. But for the moment, the direction of travel is something we can welcome. And the second positive sign I see is the very significant appointment of Tulsi Gabbard as the director of national intelligence, which is a very important, although not high-profile position, but it's nevertheless very important for keeping the deep state under some level of control. Gabbard is a woman who hasn't been afraid to take on the deep state. She opposed the policy on Syria. She actually went to Damascus in 2017 and met Assad. And more recently, she has taken a strong line on ending the Ukraine war, on Russia having been provoked, and on the US having had biolabs in Ukraine. Now, these qualities may be held against her when she comes up for approval, and I'm keeping my fingers crossed on that.
Peter, I agree with you, and we can hope that these new people who have been appointed will have the courage and the strength to challenge the deep state and pursue a policy that, from an American perspective at least, is for the Americans' people's interest. Now, breaking news has just been passed on to our studio is that Robert Kennedy Jr. Has just been elected to serve as Secretary of the Department of Health. And this was a key ally of Trump in the lead up to the election campaigning. Robert Kennedy Jr. has been elected as Trump's man for health. And that is quite interesting. And I know we are broadcasting on YouTube and there are varying opinions from our colleagues around the world on this issue. But it's futile to deny that, of course, Kennedy Jr. was at least you could call him a vaccine skeptic. And for Trump to appoint him to that position is quite controversial. It's quite interesting. So I guess in what you're saying there, in those appointments, there's another breaking appointment, a very significant appointment, and he's empowered Kennedy Jr. to this very important role in the future Trump government. What can you say about the significance of that news that just has hit the headlines?
Yes, I think these appointments hold together. It shows the triumph of skepticism about germophobia and skepticism about Russophobia. That can only be a good thing. And it shows that Trump is having the courage of his convictions. He won a resounding victory, and he's cashing in his check credits. Good for him. So I think that's an added reason to be hopeful that Trump will be steadfast in his position on Ukraine.
Well, Trump has previously said that, or indicated that he thinks NATO is obsolete, that NATO was designed to fight the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, as we know, collapsed. Well, I like to say was collapsed. It was not a natural occurrence. It was certainly externally pressured to collapse. Now that there is no more Soviet Union, one of the things that Vladimir Putin proposed years ago was, well, now that there is no Soviet Union, maybe Russia can join NATO. But of course, if Russia joined NATO, what would be the point of NATO? There would be no point of NATO. So, to this day, we see NATO as an instrument primarily formed and primarily which functions for fighting Russia and creating that, some say balance, but it's certainly not a balance when you have 55 countries in NATO on Russia's borders collectively fighting Russia and arming Russia's adversaries or neighbors, and more than just arming them, Your Excellency, it's actually, in fact, provoking. It's creating regime change like they've done in Ukraine. Lately, they have failed in Georgia, something we mentioned on our last show of NATO-NATO, and other countries, because Russia now has no trust to any sort of deals or any promises that the West may make. Russia has admitted, the Russian president has admitted, that Russia was naive to believe the West when ceasefires were put in place during the Minsk agreements with Ukraine. And that, of course, only allowed NATO to use that time people like Angela Merkel, British head of state Boris Johnson, to actually use the time under the guise of a ceasefire to pump Ukraine full of weapons, to build extensive defensive positions and offensive positions, for that matter, all along the Donbass, which now Russia finally is smashing through. Grueling fighting. These are towns and cities where tens of thousands of men are dying to take ruins. But it's a matter of principle. It's a matter of Russia's borders. It's a matter of showing, well, Russia will fight and Russians will spill blood for their country, for their motherland. And that is what NATO is challenged with. And the question is, will NATO countries like Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, will they send in 1 million men to fight? And I don't think so. I don't think that they're ready for that. I think it's time to talk about peace and it's time to sit down at the table and say no to NATO, stop NATO in its tracks. Let's hope again, same as with Rachel, it's a very similar position. I think it's a matter of Trump defeating the deep state at home to have his hands freed to then act independently and act honorably in the Middle East and in Ukraine. Let's hope that that's what's on the cards.
Well, there's a lot to chew on in what you just said, but let us remind ourselves about the purpose of NATO as it was semi-humorously described by the first Secretary General of NATO back in the early 1950s, Lord Ismay. And he said the purpose of NATO was to keep the Soviet Union out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. Now, if I were President Trump and I heard that, I would think that was typically condescending British arrogance, and it would turn me against NATO. And indeed, this does seem to be the fundamental part of Trump's attitude towards NATO, that it's a European scam to cheat the Americans, to keep the Americans tied to the old continent, spending far too many billions of dollars when these rich Europeans should be paying for their own defense. And I find it no surprise whatsoever that an American like Donald Trump, extremely transactional, what's in it for me, America first, should look askance at NATO and not have very much time for NATO. So that gives us some cause for hope, I think. And it'll be very interesting to see how Trump puts this prejudice of his, this bias against NATO into practice. The first time round, of course, it was all new to him. He was easily rolled over by the system. The deep state manipulated him. But judging by his appointments, this time he's setting off on a different foot. He's surrounding himself with heavyweight, well, some of them heavyweights, certainly people who will be loyal and supportive. So I'm personally hopeful, cautiously optimistic that Trump will translate his attitudes into early peace negotiations with Russia. And it is amusing, is it not, to see how the major European players are in denial about Trump's victory. They're carrying on as though it could be wished away, or that the deep state could very, very quickly take back the reins from Trump. And so you get the British Defense Secretary John Healey ludicrously saying that there's going to be no change on Ukraine, that he's confident that America will stand by Ukraine. How stupid can you get? It's just whistling in the dark. And when Europeans like Macron say that, oh, well, we'll stand on our own 2 feet, we'll pay for it all, we'll somehow manage to keep the game going. And there are also parallels with, of course, with climate, and we wait with interest to see who the Donald is going to make his climate czar. But again, skepticism seems to be winning the day, so we have hope on that front also.
Well, just in from Trump, I quote, he has said, for too long, Americans have been crushed by the industrial food complex and drug companies who have engaged in deception, misinformation, and disinformation when it comes to public health. The safety and health of all Americans is the most important role of any administration. And the HHS will play a big role in helping ensure that everybody will be protected from harmful chemicals, pollutants, pesticides, pharmaceutical products, and food additives that have contributed to the overwhelming health crisis in this country. Mr. Kennedy will restore these agencies to the traditions of gold standard scientific research and beacons of transparency to end the chronic disease epidemic and to make America great and healthy again. We can say that that is a direct challenge to the very powerful United States lobby of Big Pharma. That is a challenge by the President, Trump, by inserting Kennedy. This is a great sign. I mean, and this is not a great sign from just specifically for the purpose of medicine and health. That's fine. I mean, I'm not fanatical about that, but it's showing that Trump is challenging the status quo, that he is not even set foot yet. He hasn't assumed formally power as president. He's making these appointments, and he's sending a shot across the bow. And I think the same people who are responsible for the monopoly of Big Pharma, the same people that are responsible for the monopoly of the military-industrial complex. I mean, these are all people that in Washington have a dinner together, have lunch together, and drink very expensive wines and cognacs, and sit there and form the government's policies, not in the Senate, not in Congress, but over lunch with a few expensive cigars. And these are the people who, it seems now, on first glance, that Trump is in fact going after. And so on the question that we have raised tonight, is Trump capable of challenging the deep state and stopping the deep state in their tracks? Well, he's certainly saying the right things. And on the topic, of course, there of misinformation, which now Trump is accusing Big Pharma of, which is incredible, right, as the president. I mean, the platform tonight that we are broadcasting on, for example, YouTube, it has suspended and banned thousands of users, including large accounts. In fact, including the Aussie Cossack YouTube account with 170,000 subscribers for medical misinformation. Now how the tables have turned, where the president-elect himself is appointing a health minister who is calling out the misinformation from Big Pharma. We live in a very, very interesting time. It's a promising sign, isn't it, Peter? This is a very promising sign of things to come. Hopefully these things will continue, and hopefully the same rhetoric which Trump is using in these appointments applies across the line, and it's not only is it rhetoric, but it's action. I mean, what's to stop now Robert Kennedy Jr. From making an announcement saying that big tech, including social media companies, should be held to account and, in fact, should be restoring and unsuspending all of those innocent mums and dads on Facebook, on social media, on Instagram, on anywhere they were questioning the government's narrative. They should be en masse now reinstated. That would be a logical next step. So that's something I'm clearly looking forward to, and fingers crossed that's what's going to happen next. Because look, it's been a very challenging few years. The world is hurt. The world is hurting. The world is injured. They have blasted through all of these globalist, you could say, policies, and we have not had a say. The mums and dads haven't had a say, and when we've tried to say no, when we've tried to challenge the government narrative on any spectre of these issues, we have faced censorship and being shut down. But thankfully, we're still here, we're broadcasting, so there is still hope. Peter, closing remarks for tonight's show. What's your message to the world?
Well, I would repeat my cautious optimism, but then immediately qualify that by referring to the other important lobby in America, even more powerful than Big Pharma, is the big weapons industry. And the arms business is going to get in the way of Trump's Ukraine policy, because although America has been spending a lot on Ukraine, most of the money has been coming back to the American arms industry. So expect resistance on that front. But I don't want to end on a negative note. Let us enjoy the moment. Wait with anticipation, not jump to the conclusion that it will be same old, same old. This is a turning point in history, potentially. Let's see if the man steps up to the plate.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Peter Ford, former British ambassador, joining us live from London. And we'll continue now with NATO on tonight's special broadcast. We are jumping now over to our next guest, Piers Robinson, who is a British academic researcher in the field of media studies. I'm very keen to speak with him now. He's the founder of the Working Group on Syria, Propaganda and Media, has authored a number of publications on the CNN effect. Piers has attracted strong criticism from the mainstream media for disputing the use of chemical weapons in the Syrian civil war. Evidently, you're a apologist, you could say, or a fan of the Assad government, and by extension then, of course, Russia, who has been a key ally of the legitimate Syrian government. And this is the only power in Syria which is legitimate, should I mention, and the only power in Syria who has the right to invite foreign militaries to be on its soil. We know that there are plenty of American troops there, or American advisors, guarding oil wells and oil fields and so forth, but they, of course, they're illegally. The Russian contingent in Syria is there legally. Piers, welcome to the show.
It's good to be with you.
Piers, obviously I want to talk about Syria tonight, and in the larger context, I want to ask you the question, why is what's happening in Syria, its geographic proximity to key areas, it's to the south of Turkey, it's to the east of Israel and Lebanon, it's to the west of Iran. What makes Syria such an important key factor in the questions of the world's future from the perspective of security, World War III, and the possible peace talks, of course?
Sure. Well, I think primarily, I mean, the war in Syria, the war to overthrow the Syrian government, which has been running since 2011, is part of the broader regime change strategy that we've seen employed by the US government following 9/11. 9/11 was a self-inflicted wound, a false flag, initiated in order to get regime change conflicts rolling in the Middle East, essentially to restructure the Middle East. And the conflict in Syria has been for a long time and remains a central stepping stone in the neocon agenda, which has always been to ultimately tackle Iran. But to tackle Iran, you need to tackle Syria first. And so the conflict really has been caught up really very much within that framework, within that policy, which has been pursued by the West. It's a critical country also because obviously, you know, when Russia intervened to support the Syrian government in 2015, you had the first very clear sign that Western belligerence, the kind of the regime change policy, was coming unstuck. I mean, you'd had obviously the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and with those conflicts, you know, the military presence persisted, but no, the governments were overthrown, at least in Afghanistan, for a period of time. But with Syria, the attempt to overthrow the Assad government was blocked, basically, and it failed. And so I think it's the first indication of the weakening of Western hegemony and Western imperial power. But of course, now where we are today with what's going on with Israel's war against the Palestinians in Gaza and the Lebanon, the continuing possibility of a dramatic escalation against Iran, places Syria still very much at the heart of this struggle by the West to maintain its power and influence in the region in a broader geopolitical context where the West's strength is clearly waning, weakening significantly. And I guess I was just listening to your interview with Peter just then. And the question now is, what's going to happen with the incoming Trump administration? Are we going to have simply business as usual with a continuation of the regime change war, of the military industrial complex, as Peter mentioned at the end of his interview, pushing Trump, pushing him forward into war against Iran? But of course, if we get to that kind of stage, the likelihood of Russia and China remaining and standing to one side gets less and less. So therefore, the risks of a much bigger conflict emerging out of that between the West and the rest becomes an even bigger possibility. So I think that's my sort of brief summary of why I think the conflict in Syria is important and how it fits into the broader pattern of conflict that we have been seeing for the last 20 years.
Well, you're a person who champions justice. You're a person who champions justice and fairness, and you've been fighting tirelessly for the Syrian people. I mean, you're a person who can appreciate what Russia did for Syria when they stepped in, and in Syria they said no to NATO. It was Russia who stopped Syria becoming Libya. We know what happened in Libya. We know the assassination of Gaddafi in 2011 was conducted by NATO proxies. This is armed by NATO, organized by NATO, funded by NATO. And we know what happened to Libya after that, when the Libyan people were, in my opinion, of course, were fooled and tricked into overthrowing Gaddafi and killing their own president. It was a vicious way he was killed. It was terrible. I think personally that Gaddafi was an excellent leader for Libya, for the Libyan people. Gaddafi may not have been excellent for the interests of the United States or the NATO countries or other countries or the French, but he was good for his people. And now the Libyan people are crying, asking for Gaddafi back. Now, Syria would have ended up like Libya if it wasn't for the Russian intervention, if it wasn't for.
For sure. The track record of Western foreign policy just in the last 5 years, post 9/11, is absolutely appalling. The death toll attached to what we've seen in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and all of these notions that the West has been fighting some kind of humanitarian war or a war for democracy. This was known to wise observers 30 years ago. Noam Chomsky was making this point relentlessly, that the West is not about trying to help people. It's about trying to project power and secure its interests in the international system, and doing that through very violent means. That, I think, has become very clear to a much larger swathe of Western publics over the last 20 years. And as you say, what we've seen in Libya is horrific. This is what would have happened if the Syrian government had fallen to the extremist groups who were being funded by not just America, also Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Israel, all fueling the regime change war that was being fought. Is undoubtedly, I would add, in a way, my own involvement in Syria is I mean, yeah, of course I'm interested in justice and what's right, and that you always have to assess the kind of what's your normative position on a conflict when you're studying it. But of course, my involvement with Syria has really been very much about looking at what I now describe as a strategic deception over alleged chemical weapons attacks. And so you've had this narrative built by the West over many years that the Syrian government has been systematically using chemical weapons, chlorine, sarin, against its population. And that record, that is a false narrative which is being produced. And of course, and as you've been discussing with some of your earlier guests, we have Tulsi Gabbard, who has been expected to be appointed the Director of National Intelligence in the US. And of course, she had supported the OPCW, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. She had supported the whistleblowers who emerged from that organization, who'd been involved in investigating one of these alleged chemical attacks, the one in Duma in 2018. And she supported essentially the call for accountability that they were raising. And of course, what's going to be interesting to see now, because I see there's this huge panic now from a lot of commentators. Tulsi Gabbard, no way we can allow her to take that position on. And I think part of the motivation for the panic over her being potentially appointed to that position is people who have been involved in shoring up this false narrative on Syria of alleged chemical weapons attacks. It's a very, without going into all the details, it's a very dirty underbelly of Western foreign policy in the region. It has involved, as we've seen with Ghouta 2013, the murder of civilians. And we've got the hands of Western governments are bloody with those murders, I believe. And this has been going on, and they do not want that to come.
Western playbook, isn't it?
It's a familiar Western playbook,
and the same playbook in Iraq with weapons of mass destruction.
Exactly,
yes,
seen it all before.
It's very familiar.
Yeah, and so I think there is this kind of panic about her taking that position.
Yes, but it is in actual fact, it's the West who is the ones who are constructing and operating bioweapons laboratories in Ukraine, for example. And they are the ones who are involved in exactly what they accuse their opponents of. They're the ones who are killing, indiscriminately killing, bombing civilians all through the Middle East and Yemen and other places. And look, creating war wherever they can. I mean, this is not Russia creating wars all around the world. Russia is simply defending its borders, defending its interests, defending its people, just as the Syrian government is, Piers. Closing statement, please, with 2 minutes to go.
Well, I mean, Trump is coming in and he's making these appointments. I think we have to be very cautious about how this will play out. And it's very difficult to speculate on exactly what various individuals are going to do. For example, is Tulsi Gabbard going to continue with the OPCW chemical weapons issue in the way that she has done in the past? We'll have to wait and see. Lots of reasons to be very cautious because of the pro-Israeli stance that you see in the appointments he's making. However, I would say, and my final point is that we are in a situation in the international system where circumstances are very different from anything that we in the West have seen before for a very long time. That the structural shifts in the international system, the distribution of power away from the West, means that whoever's in power in the US, they are confronted with a very changed international reality. And one path that could be taken is a path which will be a diplomatic one, which disengages the West from its militaristic stance, and that will be a positive thing, and we'll have to see if Trump does that. The other option is that the West pushes itself into essentially ever greater strategic failures. We mentioned Syria being blocked by Russia. If America goes up against Iran, for example, and that draws in Russia and China, then the West will lose, as they are losing in the Ukraine. So the choice confronting Trump is to either take the wiser path and recalibrate the West's stance internationally, or business as usual, and we will only lead ourselves into ever greater failure and a hell of a lot of conflict associated with that until the shouting's all over, kind of thing.
Piers Robinson, I cannot say I disagree with you. In fact, I completely agree with you on those positions which you've shared tonight on NATO on tonight's broadcast. Thank you very much for joining us, Piers Robinson. It's been a pleasure. We look forward to seeing you back. Well, ladies and gentlemen, here we are with only minutes to go of tonight's special broadcast. It's very clear to me that there is a trend forming, that people all around the world are saying that we must make a stand. NATO is being defeated. NATO is being stopped. I mean, once upon a time, we would think NATO cannot be defeated. NATO cannot be stopped. But all around the world, as we've seen now, in fact, they are losing. In Syria, they were losing. In Libya, they disgraced themselves and destroyed a good country with a strong leader. The same they did in Iraq under false pretexts. They were defeated in Afghanistan. Where has NATO won a war? Clearly, in Ukraine, at the moment, NATO is losing. They have thrown everything they have at it. And let's just face it, it looks like many people in the West are beginning to understand and realize that NATO is not so much a military alliance as it is a business alliance. It's an excellent business plan to capture and keep enslave Western populations into paying tax to the schoolyard bully. And the schoolyard bully in this instance is the hugely powerful military-industrial complex. As our guests have mentioned tonight, when we hear about hundreds of billions of dollars being sent to Ukraine, this is not money that is reaching Ukrainian civilians, Ukrainian mums and dads, or Ukrainian people who are caught up in the war. This is money that 98% of it is actually funneled back into the coffers of private military companies, companies like Raytheon, companies like Lockheed, companies like Boeing, whose share prices continue to climb on the blood of Ukrainian people, on the blood of those being mobilized and forced into war for no reason. There is no reason why Ukraine must continue sacrificing its population, its men, women, and children. Zelensky, of course, has no regard for the Ukrainian population, for the Christian population of Ukraine, terrorizing churches, terrorizing parishioners, arresting priests, arresting bishops, arresting innocent people from the streets and sending them to die on the front lines. And I've said it before, I'll say it again. There is only one country in the world who cares about Ukraine, and that is Russia. And the faster Russia is able to complete its special military operation, the faster Russia is able to complete the aims and goals of that military operation, which is denazification, which is demilitarization. There is no desire from Russia to enslave Ukraine or enslave Ukrainians. In fact, that's why Russia has allowed this conflict to drag out, because Russia is not obliterating or destroying or annihilating Ukrainians. Russia is very selective and very careful in the way it conducts offensive operations in Ukraine, and it has done everything to maximize the preservation of civilian life. Some people in the West think, oh, Russia's weak, Russia's not strong, look how long it's taking Russia to take these cities and towns and so forth. Well, excuse me, Russia's up against 55 NATO countries. That's 55 intelligence agencies. That's 55 military-industrial complexes. 55 types of missiles, shells, ammunition, tanks, Challenger tanks from Britain, Abrams tanks from the United States, Leopard tanks from Germany, Caesar artillery pieces from France. The list goes on. Turkey, Canada, everybody's in there throwing everything they have, including mercenaries, including boots on the ground. And guess who's winning? Russia is holding the line. So yes, another place where NATO is being defeated right now is Ukraine. And as a Russian person, of course, I'm born in Australia, I want to say thank you to the great work that the Workers' Party of Britain does. For example, people like George Galloway, whose platform tonight we are broadcasting from, NATO-NATO. They do an excellent job. George Galloway and his team and his people, and those watching this broadcast, make sure you like and subscribe and share. But you are on the right side of history because you have said no to NATO. Check the links in the description below to see how you can support the work of this very important message, this very important broadcast, because the campaign to say no to NATO is only ramping up now. You can see the QR code below. We have a lot of work to do in front of us. We need to challenge the narrative, challenge the deep state, stop NATO in its tracks. With your help, we'll do that. It's been a pleasure having this broadcast with you tonight. I'm Simeon Boykov, the Aussie Cossack, broadcasting, in fact, after 700 days holed up in the Russian consulate in Sydney. Tune in next week at the same time, Friday, 8 a.m. Sydney time, New York, 4 p.m. And we will see you next week. Hopefully the world will be changed by then. We've got another 7 days in front of us. Fingers crossed. You know what to do. Keep fighting, keep questioning the narrative, keep commenting, keep spreading the word. Kennedy Jr. has been appointed to the position of Health Secretary. Let's see if he can force big tech and big censorship, who have taken many of us off these platforms, and restore these accounts, because this is the only way we're going to win. When we question the narrative, when we fight the deep state, and we say no to NATO.